When you think about the weight of the world on your shoulders, when it feels like everything is falling apart, when you're standing at the crossroads of uncertainty, you ask yourself, what do I do now? We've all faced moments in our lives where the storm seemed too fierce, the journey too long, and the road ahead too unclear. And in those moments, there's a question we must confront, a question that echoes from the deepest part of our souls. How much control do we really have? You see, control is a funny thing. It's something we want, something we fight for, something we cling to as if our lives depend on it. But the truth is, sometimes we are holding on to things that we were never meant to hold. Life doesn't come with a manual that gives us step-by-step instructions on how to get everything right, how to tie every loose end, or how to ensure that every decision we make leads us to success. And instead, life is a constant unfolding. And sometimes, in order to see the beauty in it, we have to let go. When we let go, we allow space for something greater than ourselves to step in. We allow God to take the wheel. It's not always easy. It's not always comfortable. In fact, it can feel downright terrifying. But that's where faith comes in. Faith is not about seeing the end result. Faith is about trusting the process, even when the way forward is hidden in shadow. It's about knowing that God's hands are bigger than your worries, that His wisdom surpasses your understanding, and that His timing is perfect even when it feels like nothing is happening. Let me tell you something, God is in control, even when it feels like we're spiraling out of control. When life pushes you to the edge, when everything is uncertain, and the voices in your head say you can't make it, that's when God's power is most evident. You see, it's in our weakness that His strength is made perfect. It's in our moments of struggle that we see the truth of His presence. When we think we are at the end of our rope, God's grace is always there to catch us. He's the one who can take the broken pieces of our lives and turn them into something beautiful. But here's the thing. You can't leave everything in God's hands while still trying to control the outcome. You can't say you trust Him while constantly second-guessing every move He makes. Trust means letting go of the illusion of control. Trust means saying, God, I don't know how this will work out, but I believe that You do. It's in that surrender, that moment when you stop striving to make everything fit into your perfect little box, that you'll find peace. Because peace comes when you release the need to control and give God the space to work. When you stop wrestling with the plans He has for you and just allow yourself to walk in them. The journey of faith is not about knowing all the answers. It's about following the voice of the one who has already walked the path before you. It's about recognizing that even when things seem dark, His light will shine in ways that you never could have imagined. There's a scripture that says, "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you a hope and a future." Now, do you believe that? Do you believe that God has a plan for your life even when things don't make sense? Do you believe that His plan is better than your plan? You see, when we leave everything in God's hands, we acknowledge that we are not the masters of our own fate. We recognize that God has a purpose for everything in our lives, even the struggles, the disappointments, and the detours. When things don't go as we expected, it doesn't mean God has abandoned us. It means He's shaping us, refining us, preparing us for what's next. And sometimes the detours are the very thing that leads us to our destiny. You may be sitting in a place right now where you can't understand why certain things are happening to you. You may be wondering where the road is leading, but God has a way of taking us through the wilderness, through the valley, and leading us to the mountaintop. And it's in the valley that we learn to trust Him more deeply. It's in the wilderness that we discover that He is our provider, our sustainer, and our source of strength. When you leave everything in God's hands, you shift your focus from your circumstances to His promises. You stop looking at what you don't have and you start looking at what He has already given you. You realize that God has already equipped you with everything you need for the journey ahead. He has already placed inside you the strength, the courage, the wisdom, and the resilience to overcome whatever comes your way. And when you surrender to him, when you allow him to lead, he'll guide you to places you never thought possible. But here's the catch, it's not always going to be easy. There will be times when you feel like you've taken one step forward and two steps back. There will be moments when you want to give up, when you want to throw in the towel and walk away. But that's when you have to remind yourself that God is bigger than any challenge you face. You have to remind yourself that his plans are better than your plan. You have to remind yourself that he is faithful and he will never leave you or forsake you. Leaving everything in God's hands requires a radical shift in your mindset. It's about changing your perspective from one of fear and doubt to one of faith and trust. It's about recognizing that your success, your happiness, your peace, and your joy are not dependent on your ability to control every situation, but on your willingness to surrender to God's will for your life. When you stop trying to manipulate the outcome, when you stop trying to force things to go your way, you open the door for God to move in ways that you never could have imagined. And here's the beauty of it. When you leave everything in God's hands, you can rest. You don't have to carry the burden of the world on your shoulders anymore. You don't have to worry about what the future holds because you know that God holds the future. You don't have to be anxious about your circumstances because you know that God is working all things together for your good. You can live in the peace that comes from knowing that God is in control. Now, don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying that you should sit back and do nothing. Leaving everything in God's hands doesn't mean that you become passive or complacent. It means that you do your part, but you trust God to do his part. It means that you take action, but you trust the outcome to him. It means that you give your best effort, but you trust him to bring the results. When you work with God, you become part of the divine plan and you realize that you are not in this alone. So whatever it is that you're facing today, whatever burden you're carrying, whatever fear is gripping your heart, let it go. Leave it in God's hands. Trust him to handle what you cannot. Trust him to work everything out for your good. Trust him to lead you where you need to go. And know that in the end, when you leave everything in God's hands, you will find peace, you will find purpose, and you will find the strength to keep moving forward. Remember, God is with you. He is for you, and he is in control. Trust him, let go, and watch as he transforms your life in ways you never thought possible. True peace comes when we release the need to control every outcome and trust that God's wisdom and timing are far greater than our own. Surrendering control doesn't mean inaction, but it means trusting God to handle the things we cannot. Life struggles and detours are often part of God's greater plan. Even when we don't understand the journey, trusting that God's purpose is unfolding leads to growth, resilience, and peace, knowing he works all things for our good. Leaving everything in God's hands doesn't mean being passive. It's about doing your best while trusting God with the outcome. Faith calls us to act with confidence, knowing that God is guiding our steps and will fulfill his purpose in our lives. Surrendering control to God is not an easy act. It requires a deep trust that goes beyond mere belief. It's a radical shift in perspective, a declaration that you are no longer in charge of the outcomes of your life. It's a bold decision to release your grip on the things you've tried to manage, organize, and perfect, and instead place them into hands much stronger and wiser than your own. This act of surrender isn't a one-time event. It's a continual process, a daily choice to let go of what you cannot control and entrust it to the one who can. When we talk about surrendering control to God, it doesn't mean we give up on life. It doesn't mean that we sit back passively and wait for things to happen. Surrendering control means recognizing that no matter how much we plan or try to manipulate the outcomes, we are not the ultimate authors of our own story. There's a higher power at work, and that power is God. Surrender means acknowledging that God's will is perfect, even when our human understanding falls short of seeing the bigger picture. Control is something that many of us cling to, often out of fear or insecurity. We fear what might happen if we let go. We fear that without our constant vigilance, things will fall apart. We fear that if we aren't in control, we will lose everything. But in reality, the more we try to control, the more we find ourselves drained, anxious, and overwhelmed. We carry the weight of decisions, of expectations, and of fears that we were never meant to bear alone. When we attempt to control every detail, we end up trapped in a cycle of worry, striving, and fatigue. Surrendering control is an invitation to release that burden. It's not about passivity, but about trust. It's saying, I will do what I can, but I will trust God to handle what I cannot. It's about recognizing the limits of your own strength and wisdom. It's about admitting that despite your best efforts, you do not have all the answers, and that's okay. Surrender allows us to place our trust in God's infinite wisdom and understanding, knowing that He sees the entire picture while we can only see a fraction. To surrender control means letting go of our need to know every detail and having the courage to walk by faith, even when the path ahead is unclear. Life often presents us with uncertainties, situations that challenge our understanding, and events that feel beyond our control. It's in these moments, when things seem uncertain or even chaotic, that surrender becomes essential. In those moments, we must make the conscious decision to trust that God's plan is unfolding even when we cannot see the next step. Surrendering control also requires humility. It's acknowledging that we are not the center of the universe, that our way is not always the best way, and that our own efforts are limited. Humility doesn't come naturally to many of us because we are taught to be self-reliant, to make things happen and to take charge of our lives. But true strength is found in the willingness to submit to God's authority, recognizing that He knows what is best for us, even when it's difficult to accept. One of the most profound aspects of surrender is realizing that God's plans are bigger than our own. When we release control, we open ourselves up to the possibility of something far greater than what we could have ever orchestrated. There's a divine purpose behind everything we experience, both the triumphs and the trials. God doesn't waste any moment in our lives. When we choose to surrender, we acknowledge that there's a bigger story being written, a story that is far more significant than just our own immediate desires or ambitions. It's in surrendering control that we open ourselves to God's guidance. The more we let go of our own plans, the more we make room for His plans. God is not distant or indifferent to our struggles. He is intimately involved in every aspect of our lives, and He desires to lead us in the right direction. Surrendering control means opening ourselves up to God's direction, trusting that He will guide us in the ways we should go. This doesn't always mean that the path will be easy or without obstacles, but it means that we can walk with confidence, knowing that we are not walking alone. Surrendering control is also a declaration of faith. It's saying, I believe that God is in control and that He is trustworthy. It's choosing to trust His timing even when it doesn't align with our own expectations. It's about believing that God's plan for us is better than our own, even when it doesn't make sense in the moment. When we surrender, we are placing our trust in God's goodness and faithfulness, knowing that He has our best interests at heart. It's important to remember that surrender is not a passive resignation to whatever happens. It's an active choice to trust God's will over our own. It's a commitment to seek His guidance and to follow His leading, even when the road is uncertain. Surrendering control is not the same as giving up. It's about yielding our plans to God, knowing that He can bring about something far greater than what we could have ever imagined on our own. For many of us, surrendering control can be a daily struggle. We live in a world that tells us to be in charge, to take control, and to make things happen. We are encouraged to rely on our own abilities, to take matters into our own hands, and to do everything we can to achieve success. But surrendering control to God means stepping outside of this mindset. It means choosing to trust in His sovereignty even when everything around us seems out of control. In those moments of doubt or fear, we must remind ourselves that God is good, that He is faithful, and that He is working all things together for our good. Surrendering control doesn't mean that life will be free from difficulty or pain. It means that we have a deep assurance that no matter what happens, God is with us. He is in control and He will never leave us or forsake us. His presence is our comfort and His guidance is our strength. As you walk through life, you will encounter situations that challenge your sense of control. You will face moments when you feel helpless, uncertain, or even lost. But in those moments, remember that surrendering control to God is not a sign of weakness, but of faith. It is a sign of trust in the one who holds the universe in His hands and who cares deeply about every detail of your life. When you let go and trust Him, you will discover a peace that surpasses understanding, a peace that comes from knowing that the Creator of all things is in control and He is guiding you every step of the way. Faith in God's plan is a cornerstone of the Christian journey. It is the very foundation upon which we stand, especially in the face of uncertainty, difficulty, or confusion. It's an unwavering belief that no matter what circumstances look like or how challenging the road ahead may seem, God has a purpose for everything. It is not just a passive belief, but an active trust that His plan is unfolding perfectly, even when we can't see it. In a world that values self-determination, where we are told to make our own way, faith in God's plan often feels countercultural. It challenges the deeply ingrained notion that we must control every detail of our lives, that we must make every decision, and that the success or failure of our lives is solely in our hands. But the truth is, faith in God's plan requires us to surrender that control. It asks us to trust in something bigger than ourselves, to believe that there is an all-knowing, all-powerful God who has a purpose for us that is far greater than anything we could design for ourselves. The Bible is full of stories that exemplify the importance of trusting in God's plan. Take Abraham, for example. He was asked by God to leave his home and go to a place he had never seen before, to trust in a promise that seemed impossible. God promised him that his descendants would become a great nation. Yet at the time, Abraham had no children. And when he finally did have a son, the promise didn't come immediately. It came through many years of waiting, of unanswered questions, and of hardship. Abraham's faith in God's plan was tested repeatedly, but through it all, he held fast to the belief that God would fulfill His promise, even when circumstances made it seem unlikely. Abraham's story is a testament to the fact that God's plan is often bigger and more intricate than we can understand at first glance. And faith in His plan is about trusting in His timing and His methods, even when they don't make sense to us. Then there's the story of Joseph. Joseph's life was marked by betrayal, rejection, and suffering. His brothers sold him into slavery, and he was falsely accused and imprisoned. Yet through all of this, Joseph maintained his faith that God had a purpose for his life. He could not have known at the time, but the hardships he faced were preparing him to save his family and a nation from famine. His faith in God's plan allowed him to rise above the hurt and disappointment, to forgive those who wronged him, and to trust that God was working all things together for good. Joseph's story shows us that God can take the broken pieces of our lives and weave them into something beautiful, even when it feels like everything is falling apart. These stories are powerful because they reveal a profound truth. God's plan for our lives is not always about immediate comfort or visible success. Often His plan takes us through difficult seasons and unexpected detours, shaping us along the way. Faith in God's plan is not about having all the answers or knowing exactly what the future holds. It's about trusting that no matter what happens, God is working behind the scenes for our good. In the book of Jeremiah, we are reminded of God's faithfulness and His plans for us. Jeremiah 29:11 tells us, "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans for welfare and not for evil, to give you a future and a hope." This verse offers great comfort because it assures us that God's plans for us are good. Even when life doesn't seem to make sense, even when things don't turn out the way we expected, we can trust that God's plans are designed to prosper us, to give us a future filled with hope. Faith in God's plan requires us to take our eyes off of ourselves and to focus on the bigger picture. It's easy to get caught up in our own plans, desires, and timelines, but the truth is that God's vision for our lives far exceeds what we can imagine. Our understanding is limited. We only see the present moment and perhaps a few steps ahead, but God sees the beginning and the end. He knows what we need before we even ask, and He knows the way forward even when we feel lost or confused. Faith in His plan means trusting that He knows what He's doing, even when we can't see the path clearly. This doesn't mean that we should be passive or complacent in our faith. Faith in God's plan doesn't imply that we should sit back and do nothing. We are called to take action, to use the gifts and talents He has given us, and to pursue the calling He has placed on our lives. But true faith means that we do all of this while trusting in God's sovereignty over the outcome. It means that we trust Him to open the right doors, to guide our steps, and to give us the wisdom to make decisions even when the way is unclear. It's about making our plans but holding them loosely, knowing that God's plan may differ from our own and that His way is always better. One of the most powerful aspects of faith in God's plan is the peace that it brings. When we trust that God is in control, we can rest in the assurance that He will not leave us to figure things out on our own. We no longer need to strive, worry, or panic about the future. We can face each day with confidence, knowing that He is guiding us. Even when we don't understand why certain things are happening, we can have peace knowing that God has a reason, and that reason is always for our good. However, faith in God's plan doesn't come without challenges. There will be moments when the waiting feels unbearable, when the answers are slow to come, or when the difficulties seem over. In those times, we are reminded that faith is not about perfect understanding, but about trusting in God's goodness. It's about holding on to the belief that He will make a way, even when there seems to be no way. The Bible tells us that without faith it is impossible to please God, Hebrews 11:6. And this reminds us that our faith is not based on the visible or the immediate, but on the unseen and the eternal. There are times when we may feel as though our prayers go unanswered, when we question if God really has a plan for us, or when we begin to doubt His goodness. But those are the moments that test our faith the most. It's in those moments of doubt that we must choose to press forward, to cling to the truth that God's plan is still unfolding, even when we can't see it. We are called to trust Him, not just in the good times, but in the challenging ones as well. Faith in God's plan is not a guarantee that life will be without struggles. In fact, the Bible promises that we will face trials and tribulations, John 16:33. However, it also promises that God will be with us through it all, guiding, strengthening, and comforting us along the way. His plan includes both the mountaintops and the valleys, and it is through the valleys that our faith is refined and our character is shaped. When we place our trust in God's plan, we are declaring that we believe He is good, that He is faithful, and that He is always working for our good. It's a declaration that we trust His timing, that we trust His wisdom, and that we trust His love for us. It's a belief that no matter where life leads us, God's plan is always worth trusting, even when we can't see the full picture. When we live by faith in God's plan, we walk in peace, in hope, and in the assurance that He is always with us, guiding us toward His perfect purpose. Living with trust and action is a powerful and dynamic combination. It's the belief that God has a purpose for our lives, combined with the willingness to step out in faith and take the necessary steps to fulfill that purpose. Too often, people may speak of faith and trust in God, but the true test of that faith comes when action is required. Trust without action is like a tree without roots, seemingly present but lacking the ability to grow, flourish, and provide. On the other hand, action without trust is like running without direction, exhausting, pointless, and easily losing momentum. Trusting in God is not a passive exercise. It is active, alive, and requires us to engage with our circumstances in a way that honors Him. Many people struggle with the concept of trusting God because it often involves stepping into the unknown, walking paths that seem uncertain, or making decisions that don't always make sense. But trusting God is not about having all the answers, nor is it about knowing every step we must take. It is about knowing that God is in control, that He has a plan for our lives, and that His ways are higher than ours. Living with trust is about leaning into His guidance and knowing that even when things don't go as we expect, His hand is still at work. One of the most fundamental aspects of living with trust is understanding that God's plan is often bigger than we can see. It can be challenging when we feel the weight of a decision or the fear of the unknown creeping in. We often want certainty. We want to know that our actions will lead us to success or that the path we take will bring us peace. But trusting God requires us to let go of the need for certainty and embrace faith in the unseen. We are called to walk by faith, not by sight. The challenge is not that we are walking in the dark, but that we must trust in the one who holds the light. We may not always understand the journey, but trust means that we believe God has a reason, even in the waiting and uncertainty. Action comes in when we recognize that God's plan isn't going to happen passively. There are times in life when God calls us to step out, to move forward in faith, even if we don't have the whole picture. Living with trust and action means that we don't just sit around waiting for everything to fall into place, but we make decisions that align with God's will and take steps towards the dreams and callings He's placed in our hearts. It's important to realize that while God is sovereign and in control, He also calls us to be co-laborers with Him in His work. We cannot sit back and expect everything to happen while we remain passive. We must engage with the world around us and take action. One of the most well-known examples of living with trust and action is the story of Abraham. Abraham was called by God to leave his home, his family, and everything familiar to him and go to a land that God would show him. The Bible tells us that Abraham trusted God and obeyed, even though he didn't know exactly where he was going. His trust in God required action. He didn't simply say, "I believe in God's promise," and stay put. Instead, he moved forward, took action, and made decisions that aligned with what he believed God had called him to do. That trust led him to the fulfillment of promises that were greater than anything he could have ever imagined. Another profound example is found in the life of the Apostle Peter. When Jesus called him out onto the water, Peter had to trust that Jesus would hold him up. The moment Peter stepped out of the boat, he acted on his faith. He didn't sit back waiting for a sign that everything was going to work out perfectly. Instead, he took the first step, trusting that Jesus would meet him there. Of course, when Peter began to doubt, he started sinking. But the key moment was that he stepped out in the first place. Jesus met him in his faith-filled action. Trusting in God requires us to take steps toward the things He's called us to, even if we don't have everything figured out. Trust and action are often intertwined, as both are necessary to walk in the fullness of what God has for us. It's one thing to say, "I trust God," but it's another thing entirely to live out that trust by taking bold, faithful steps. Sometimes those steps feel like risks, but the reality is that when we trust in God, we are never taking risks in the way that the world defines them. Trusting God's plan is always safer, always wiser, and always more fulfilling than relying on our own strength or ability to control outcomes. The Bible tells us that we can do all things through Christ who strengthens us. Philippians 4:13, but that requires action. We are called to take the steps, trusting that God will equip us along the way. Living with trust and action also requires patience. There will be times when the results of our actions aren't immediately visible, and the waiting can test our resolve. During these moments, we must remember that God is faithful. Trust means we rely not on the timeline we've set, but on God's perfect timing. There's a saying that sometimes the hardest part is not knowing, but continuing to believe in the unseen. It's easy to trust when everything is going according to plan, but it's much harder when the plan is unclear, when the answers seem delayed, and when we face obstacles along the way. Patience in these times allows us to continue living in faith, knowing that God is working behind the scenes, even when we don't see immediate results. But action is still required. It's important to understand that God's will is not just a passive thing that we wait for sometimes. He asks us to keep moving even when we don't have the full picture. In the story of the Israelites, when they were faced with the Red Sea, they had to take the first step. Moses could have stood still, waiting for God to part the sea, but God told them to step forward. The waters didn't part until they obeyed and acted on their trust. Living with trust and action means that we don't wait for everything to be perfect or clear before we move. We take the first step, trusting that God will meet us in that space and guide us the rest of the way. The combination of trust and action doesn't just impact our individual lives. It also affects those around us. When we live by faith, others are inspired by our boldness, our perseverance, and our reliance on God. The story of our faith becomes a testimony to others of what is possible when we trust in God's plans and step out in obedience. Our actions not only reflect our trust in God, but can also lead others to trust Him more fully in their own lives. Living with trust and action is not always easy, but it is always worth it. It's a journey that requires us to step outside of our comfort zones, to face uncertainty, and to trust in God's ability to bring good from every situation. As we live out our trust in Him, He equips us with the strength, wisdom, and courage to act, to move forward, and to grow in faith. Trust and action go hand in hand. They are two sides of the same coin, and only when they work together can we fully experience the abundant life God has promised. By trusting in God's guidance and acting on His direction, we not only fulfill our own purpose, but also become instruments of His love, grace, and truth to the world around us.